right, so welcome everybody. We are super excited to be having our first of 3 workshops focused on effective conversations. Tonight is focused on how we work with and map out our personal networks of who we're going to talk to and getting started on how we have those conversations. I am so excited that we have Brandyn Keating to work with us on it. She'll do better than I am at telling her background. And before I turn it over to her, I just want to briefly say how just this event an event like this doesn't happen without a lot of people helping. Really want to particularly acknowledge Jill Mitchler and Dan Dietrich, our 2 state coordinators, and Jay Edgar, who's our tech host tonight. And then there are a million other people I could, but I just want to say that it's phenomenal how everybody's pitching in across the state to make all these good things happen. And then speaking of the state, so we have a lot of folks here from Wisconsin, but actually you might be interested to know we have 10 or more from Ohio and Michigan each. States in our Great Lakes region and a few from North Carolina, welcome. And maybe a few other states are here. And I'm just really glad that this is kind of spreading out a little from Wisconsin, even while Wisconsin remains all in on Wisconsin. Um, at the end, we will give you links to when the next workshops are. And early next week, we will send out the recording as promised, along with links to register for the next 2 workshops that Brandon's doing. And with that, I think I'm just going to turn it right over to you, Brandyn. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Madeline. Hi, everyone. It's such a great pleasure to be here with you all. And Jay, would it be all right and possible if we could do the view for a minute so that I can see all of the people?
You bet. And you can always change to gallery view yourself if you want.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Thank you for saving me from myself. Okay, perfect. So again, my name is Brandyn Keating. I'm super delighted to be here with y'all and would love for everybody to just take a moment to type into the chat your name, where you're zooming in from, and one thing that is making you really want to be engaged this election cycle in talking to potential voters. So we'll take a minute to do that. And while we're doing that, I'm also interested to know if there's anybody here. I saw John Sabin, who I think like a year and a half ago was a catalyst for me to come do a training for a group of CCL folks. And I'm just wondering, by a show of hands, it could be your physical hand or your electronic hand, if anybody else in this Zoom room tonight was at that training back in 2022. Okay, cool. So it looks like not really, except John. So John, for you and Madeline, there will be a little bit of repeat from that training, but it looks like for everybody else, it'll be new information. And also, by a show of hands, physical or electronic, how many of y'all were at the in-person training that Madeline and the team conducted on March 2nd, where we kind of gave the overview of this program? Quite a few. Okay, great. Awesome. Let's check out our chat here. I see we have Madison, Wisconsin. We have Midland, Michigan. We have Delafield, Wisconsin, Madison area, Appleton. Awesome. I see Pat Nelson interested in the topic of deep canvassing. Mike says he wants the next federal leadership to preserve the IRA. Phil says, got to save this country. Yep, that's no small order, no small ambitions here. So we will work on that together. I'm super delighted to see all these different municipalities within Wisconsin, because in 2008, I was the Get Out the Vote director for President Obama in the state of Wisconsin for the general election, and got to travel the whole state doing Get Out the Vote training. By way of background, for those who haven't met me yet, I've spent about a little over now, 20 years. The number keeps growing, working at the intersection of behavioral science and voter engagement and mobilization. So I've worked with academics and practitioners to conduct first of their kind studies on the best ways to persuade and mobilize voters and to change voter behavior. And now I run a nonprofit that is nonpartisan, inclusive to people all across the political spectrum and those that are politically homeless, called Unify. And that spelled funny, as you might be able to see in my name label. It's YOU. NIFY. And so we build our own chapters and teams across the country in 40 different US states. And we also are super happy to work with partners to build their capacity to create change. And so it's been just an absolute pleasure and honor to get to know John and Madeline and to conduct a couple of trainings with y'all in the past. And I'm really excited for this series. So we'll go ahead and kick it off. I'm going to go ahead and share out my screen. Can everybody see this title slide that says personal network mapping and relational outreach for voter engagement?
Yep.
Yes.
Voter mobilization. Awesome. Okay, so the goals for our session tonight are first to understand the unique role of relational outreach in 2024 and the special difference that y'all can make in this election year. And then we're going to dig into the nitty-gritty of mapping our personal networks and make sure that everybody understands how to do that. And we'll have a little bit of time in breakouts in order to get started with that. And then we'll come back and start to dig into the basics of relational outreach. We'll talk about some skills that we can use to help persuade, engage, and mobilize people from our personal networks. We'll start that with a broader introduction that touches on the brain science and some broad stroke skills. And then we'll start to get introduced to the BRAVE framework for having these conversations. And that's a 5-step process that anybody can learn, that we all will learn. And we'll get deeper in that in the next session, but we'll get started with understanding it tonight. And you'll walk away both with the ability to go ahead and map your personal networks and to even start having some of the conversations. Okay, so first, for context, why would we even do relational outreach? And I'm actually going to stop sharing out my screen for a minute. I know that that I previewed some of the headlines of the reasons why, but with that slide, but I'd just love to hear from y'all, like, why do you think it matters to talk to people that we actually know, that are in our personal networks, in our families, at our workplaces, at the coffee shops that we frequent? Why do that in addition to some of the more traditional sort of phone calls, door knocks, mailings, and so forth that are done during an election year? What are folks' thoughts on why relational outreach might be important or be able to play a special role? Feel free to raise a physical or electronic hand or type in the chat. Awesome. I see Catherine says relationship trust breaks through the barriers of party tribalism. I would love to hear more about that. Catherine, are you in a position to come off mute and share a little bit?
I can, definitely.
Awesome. And where are you, Catherine?
Hello. I'm actually running for city council with, here, and one of the things that I found is our race has become very partisan and in our mayoral and our city council, and those aren't supposed to be partisan. And so we got people on opposite positions of things very quickly, just because of the tribes we belong to instead of, but I personally, for my race, have been able to talk to people from both parties and unidentified parties and come at it because they know me, and so they know that I can be a trusted source, or at least that I'm going to listen before that barrier comes up.
Awesome. Yeah, that trust, that relational fabric, super helpful tools in having these conversations and moving out of those TV talking points and sort of caricatures of the parties that are so much in our social media and on our airwaves. Awesome. And Michael, this is a really interesting and fabulous point. I see that you say here, Michael Arney says, if it's done well, it could enhance the relationships themselves, regardless of whether the person is swayed or not. I'd love to hear more about that, Michael, if you're in a position to come off of mute.
Yeah, I don't have too much more to say about it, except I guess it points to that it's important that it's done well, because I've tried to get in political conversations where it hasn't enhanced the relationship much. It's just identified an area not to go to. So I guess that was a hopeful comment.
Yes, well, I will assure you that all the skills that we're going to learn tonight and in the next session where we do the deeper dive into Brave will absolutely help ensure that that can be the case. So I was really glad to see that hopeful statement, and we'll work hard to make it true together. I also see to inform voters about, oops, I scrolled up too high. I see greater impact. I see credibility. A person someone trusts is probably more influential, says Lisa. Another higher trust from Mike Jury. And David, a great point. These are people that we will see again. Fantastic. So everybody is right on the money. And just to kind of draw out a few of these points, you know, in an election cycle, one of the challenges, particularly as people answer their telephones less, answer their doors to people they don't know less, are home less, one challenge is just finding the people, right? Is just actually getting into a conversation with people about voting. And it's also true that there's only a subset of the population that is ever targeted by those mobilization phone calls and door knocks. And so to find those people and just even be able to start the conversation, working through our relationships allows us to have 100% contact rate, right? We don't have to wonder or worry if a stranger is going to answer the door or pick up the phone. So those tactics and strategies are super important. And this kind of outreach through our personal networks provides a complement to those strategies and tactics that helps create um, an additive tactic that can mobilize more total voters at the end of the day. The second is that as we get closer and closer to election day, there will be an enormous amount of noise from mailings, from TV ads, from texts, from the phone calls and door knocks. And again, those phone calls and door knocks are really important and they need to happen. And some people are going to feel that that's a little bit of an impersonal contact or just overwhelmed by all the political information that's coming at them. And so to have a conversation from somebody that they trust can really help cut through that noise and confusion. And then the third is creating the conditions for behavior change. We absolutely can create behavior change through these other mechanisms, and particularly through phone calls and door knocks. And those are important mechanisms for behavior change. And we have the opportunity to, with our relational outreach, to have a more nuanced conversation, right? And with a person that we know, somebody said it in the chat, we might even be able to have more than one conversation with them. This could be an ongoing conversation leading up to and continuing past election day about civic engagement and about being a climate voter. And so that's an opportunity where we can have more nuance and more depth to help people move through what might be cognitive dissonance, which we'll talk about in a bit, and forward to action, and to really break down some of the emotional barriers to voting. Couple key lessons from network science, from network science are relevance and redundancy. What this means is that if we're going to change people's behavior, the message that we use or the conversation that we have with them needs to be relevant. And also the messenger needs to be relevant. And so you all are able to speak with people that you know and we all are able to speak with people that we know in a way that can feel much more relevant because we really deeply know the context in which they live. We know about them, and we can engage that knowledge about them to make our conversation more relevant, both because of the content and because we are relevant to them. And what redundancy means is that in a network science context, it means that hearing the same message from a few different people that are important to that person can be helpful. So as we're having these conversations in our personal networks, there can be sort of a snowballing effect where, maybe you talk to the one friend and the one friend says to the other friend, oh, geez, Madeline said this to me the other day, and it really made me think differently about this election. And you can also gain redundancy by being able to have multiple conversations with the person. So, relational outreach is an incredibly powerful tool in our toolkit, and it's a tool that can provide a marginal value add over other tools in the sort of voter mobilization toolkit, so that it has a very unique role to play. Okay, so into the nitty gritty now of mapping our personal networks. So I want to invite everybody to think about where all of the places are that you encounter people in the course of a day or a week or a month. So there are a few categories that I put on this little map over to the right that are pretty common, right? Work is one category. You might encounter people from your family. You might have a hobby. Maybe there's a book club that you go to. Maybe you do karate or play the piano or take yoga classes or go to the gym, right? We all have things that we do regularly where we see other people. Maybe you have children or grandchildren or brothers and sisters, and you go to their soccer games. So just thinking about where are all the places where you encounter people and have small talk, where people might ask you, how are you? What's new? Right? Um, sometimes we get a little nervous about how to start these conversations. And I've found that one of the easiest ways to start these conversations is not to make it necessarily I'm going to sit down with you and talk with you about being a voter, but just to let people know that what's going on in your life is that you really care about this election a lot. And you can sort of very gently say that, what you've been up to is thinking about how more of us can get out and vote and why you've been thinking about that, and sort of gently segue into the conversation that way. So you might also see people at places where you go and shop, maybe the coffee shop or the grocery store, if there's a restaurant that you frequent, where you get your hair cut, or where you get your nails done, whatever kind of things that you do in the course of a day, week, or month where you see people who you might have a little bit of small talk with, all the way from that little bit of small talk to a very deep relationship. And I see that David put in the chat and would love to see other folks' ideas as well. Church is a great one. Church, neighbors, those are places that we certainly run into people on a regular basis. How do I pronounce your name? Is it Jun or Yun or something else?
June, like the month.
June. Door number 3. Thank you. June says school. Great. Those are wonderful thoughts. So hopefully that helps get the juices going. And what we're going to go ahead and do now is take about 3 minutes just to think about the categories of places where you run into people in the course of a day, a week, or a month, and start to fill some people into those categories. So you can do this by drawing circles like I had on the slide. If you're a bullet point person, you can do it by bulleting it out. If you have a piece of paper nearby, you can use that. If you want to open a document on your computer or you have your phone, whatever is easy for you. But when this 3 minutes is up, what we're going to do is go ahead and move into breakouts. And we're just going to discuss who we came up with. And when we do that, we're going to talk about what is one thing that we think might be challenging about the conversation with a couple of those people, and what is one value that we share with those people. So I'll say that again before we go into the breakouts. Don't worry. For now, you can just do your bullets and start listing your names. And Jay, while people are doing their bullets or their circles and listing their names, if we could go ahead and set up breakouts to be done randomly in groups of 4.
Okay.
Awesome. So again, right now you're just bulleting out the categories, and then within those categories, starting to think of some, like literally who the people are, their names, and write them down. And you probably won't get all the way there in the 3 minutes, but this is just to get the juices flowing. And then we'll come into conversation with one another, both to spark additional ideas and to start talking about those other 2 pieces, which I'll repeat again before we go into the breakouts. So I'm going to give you about 2.5 more minutes to do your bulleting, and then we'll move into the breakouts. Or circling, whichever resonates with you. And these could be people that we already know agree with us on climate change, but we don't know if they're going to vote or not. They could be people that disagree with us on climate change, but we think maybe we share some values with them and it's confusing as to why they disagree with us. And we think maybe a conversation could help that, or we're a little bewildered, maybe just if you're bewildered about why the person maybe isn't in agreement on climate change yet. That's a great person to outreach to. It could be somebody that we just don't know. I know in our training on the 2nd, one gentleman brought up that he'd had a not so productive conversation with a leader in the local Rotary, I think it was, and was hoping to have a more productive conversation. So anywhere on that spectrum is totally great, whether they're already in agreement on climate or not. And we have just under a minute left to do our initial round of mapping here. Okay, I've just put the instructions for the breakout into the chat. I'll read them as well. But you might want to either just sort of make a couple notes in case they don't follow all the way through to the breakout, make a couple of notes about them or take a picture with your phone if you have your phone nearby, or a screenshot or copy and paste them, whatever works for you so that you can make sure they go with you into the breakout. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to have 4 people to a breakout, and you're going to go around your little 4-person Brady Bunch circle and introduce yourself with your name and where you live. And then you're going to share the categories that you came up with of where you encounter people, which might provide some inspiration from for the rest of the group. And then you're going to pick out 2 people from your list and share one thing that you think might be a challenge in the conversation with them and one value that you share with them. So when I say a value that you share with them, what I mean is, do you know about this person that you both care about community responsibility, safety and security, truth and honesty? Is there a time when you've seen them be kind? Is there a time when you've seen them do something for others? Just anything that you both care about, equal opportunity, something at the values level that you share with them. So I'm going to ask before we go to the breakouts, if there are any questions, any clarifications about what we're doing in the breakout. Folks can raise a hand or put in the chat, a physical or an electronic hand.
How much time do you want for the breakouts?
Great question. Let's make the breakouts for 7 minutes.
Great. Thank you.
Lisa.
Just to clarify, you want us to, it's disagreement over climate change, not disagreement over whether or not they're gonna vote. Which one were we looking at?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a disagreement. It can just be anything you think will be challenging about the conversation. So, for example, a thing that could be challenging about the conversation is they don't agree with me on climate change. So there are 2 hurdles, right? There's climate change and then voting. Another challenge could be they are frustrated with the whole system and they want to burn it down. A challenge could be they don't think it's polite to talk about politics and we don't know how to open the conversation. So literally any challenge under the sun is okay. Or it could just be that, like, I get nervous when I'm bringing these things up with people, right? It could be something just about yourself as well. So one challenge and one value that you share. Any other questions before we break out? All right, awesome. So Jay, I think we are off to the races, and y'all will give you a warning halfway through and when there is 1 minute left. All right. Here we are, we're just about all back, I think. And would love to hear from folks in the chat. And then I'll call a couple people off of mute to share. But would love to hear any light bulb moments in terms of categories. Meaning, did somebody in your group come up with a category that sparked an idea for you that you hadn't thought of yet? So that's one question. And then the other question is, would just love to hear from folks what challenges and shared values came up. I'll give folks a minute to share that in the chat. And if there are any other little light bulbs or questions that came up, feel free to share those as well.
Allie's hand was up.
Oh, great. And I see this brilliant one in the chat, Christmas card list. That is so fabulous. Oh my goodness. And yes, I'm sorry, who had the raised hand? Please go ahead.
I did, but it's so simple. Standing in line. And that was Mary Ann's, I think, yeah, Mary Ann's, from her list.
Standing in line is such a great one. I've worked with so many volunteers who have had amazing conversations standing in line. And you can even like, if you want to kind of take it to the next level, you can wear some kind of a little pin or a t-shirt or, you know, if you carry a purse or a briefcase or a backpack, you can put something on there that will promote conversation if you want to go to the sort of hardcore level, but even just striking up conversations with folks standing in line is an excellent one. Places that we volunteered with the shared value of love of nature, love that. Parents of the kids' friends. Oh yeah, that's such a good one. Excellent. Pickleball, lots of sitting and waiting. Brilliant, love that. Siblings, yep, siblings, family, brilliant. Oh yeah, and if you do hiking, this Deb said one of our members volunteers at the park and gets to talk to people at trails. Neighbors working in their gardens, so good, yeah. Oh, Jill, tell us about your sticker and your stranger. That'll be fabulous.
Yeah, we were out in California. I don't remember what the sticker was on the back of my phone, but it was definitely political and environmental related. And some lady saw it and asked me about it, and we started, you know, a conversation about things that we were seeing in our state, especially environmentally, and what we were involved in and doing with it. And of course, other people are listening to us have the conversation. They're not jumping into it, but it was fun. And I didn't even
Awesome.
realize I had the sticker on there that they saw.
And that's the key, is having fun with it. Honestly, I mean, sometimes we get so, because these challenges that we're trying to solve are so serious, right? And because for good reasons, because we do feel so deeply about it and that it's such an emergency, both climate and voting, twin emergencies, that we get really heavy about these things, right? So remembering to keep the lightness and the joy and just let it be, a little bit of a light conversation that crops up in these different settings, which we will approach with intention, can be really helpful. I see concerts, which I love so much. And Kim has a great idea. If we have a button on our backpacks, maybe have it address a shared value rather than using the label environment or something obviously political. Start from values. Fabulous. Yeah, these are all doorways in to conversation, which is fantastic. So I'm interested to hear a little bit more from folks about any challenges that came up. Start a climate cafe. That's lovely. Any challenges that came up around the group, and anybody that that came up with shared values that they have with the people on their list. Would love to hear what some of those shared values are and what some of those challenges we foresee are. So if folks want to do a little of that typing in the chat, and I'm actually going to just, as you type that in the chat, I'm going to shift my curtain so I'm not blinded here. The sun just shifted, as you might be able to tell. So we have plumbers and other service people as another suggestion, which is a fantastic suggestion. Thinking about service people is really great. And Lisa asks, how does one talk to someone they value and respect, but know that they are not likely to agree? How do we do that respectfully and help that person explore their curiosity, thoughts about climate change? We're going to spend the entire rest of this session on that and the entirety of the next one. So we'll check back in on that question throughout. Okay. Catherine, you know somebody who's libertarian but likes hunting in the outdoors. Leah, respect for each other's autonomy. challenge, someone that believes in limited government and getting our news from very different sources, shared value, love for our kids. Awesome. Okay. So we'll come back to these as we go through the steps for these conversations. I'm going to share back out my screen. And can folks see this screen that says Intro to Relational Conversations? Perfect. All right, so there are going to be two doorways into these conversations. We'll come back to this. I just want to name that for some folks will already be in agreement on climate. And for other folks, we're going to be doing sort of a two-step of talking about climate and then maybe moving to voting. I say that door number 2 here is shared values. In reality, we will ultimately be engaging around share values with both doors. But with the folks who don't yet agree with us on climate necessarily, we're going to put that a little bit more up front. Okay. So in these conversations, we are likely to encounter people because we are trying to create behavior change that aren't always already planning to do the behavior that we will hope that they do, right? We might be talking to people who aren't excited about being a climate voter, who aren't excited about voting. And so we might be hearing some things with which we vigorously disagree. So the question that I have for the group is to think about a moment when you have gotten into conversation with somebody. Maybe it's somebody that was on your list, maybe not. And maybe you envisioned the conversation and never had it on purpose. Or maybe you actually got into the conversation and they shared something with you with which you vigorously disagree. Just thinking for a moment about what does your body do in that moment when you hear that thing with which you vigorously disagree. So would love to hear that in the chat. Folks can raise a hand that is physical or electronic if you would like. I see increased heart rate. Steve, I get tense. Leah, tense up, brain freezes, clench my teeth, wince, eye rolling, which I try to suppress, tense up, get wide-eyed. Urge to set them straight. Yep. These are all things that I personally have experienced, and they are very natural things because what is happening is that our bodies are going into fight or flight mode, right? Our fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, tongue twister. Right? So our shoulders might come up and become earrings, our arms might cross, we might start to breathe a little bit heavy. And as Jill mentioned, we also might have an irrepressible urge to set them straight. And we might suddenly share many, many facts. We might text them articles. We might say a lot of facts very quickly, all in a row. Has anybody ever been that person? Me too. And how did that work out? No, I see a big thumbs down from Jay. Yeah. Yeah. So, what happens when we, in a very well-intentioned way, try to help people find the truth, correct them with our facts, is that we often create what social psychologists call backlash effect. And I'll unpack that a little bit more in a moment. Part of the background for what backlash effect is that we have a couple of myths that permeate the atmosphere in which we live. One is that Americans are deeply and immovably divided on climate change. In reality, if we think about solutions related to climate change, we tend to have over 70%, in many cases over 80% agreement on all around the political spectrum among people. The second myth is that facts are the solution for solving our division on climate change. And while we certainly don't want to leave facts behind, we also need to kind of pause that urge that we have to jump in with all of them all at once in order for people to be able to actually connect with us and hear us and to avoid backlash effect. So what backlash effect is when the person that we're speaking with digs in their heels to their pre-existing belief upon hearing our very impassioned arguments and well-researched facts. And, if have you ever had a moment where you're like, wait a minute, I know this person is incredibly intelligent and I just sent them the article, like I just told them the things. Why do they not agree with me now? Um, I know that I've had that moment, and that is partially because when we come at people with our facts and with our impassioned arguments, um, if we are asking them to think a thing that they do not already think or do a thing that they were not already planning to do, what they are hearing from us, even though it's not our intention, is that their pre-existing belief or behavior is wrong, bad, or stupid. And nobody wants to feel wrong, bad, or stupid. So the conversation has ceased to be about climate change. We're not talking about climate change anymore, or voting, or whatever the topic was. Rather, we're talking about whether or not that person's pre-existing belief or position is wrong, bad, or stupid. Even if that's never said out loud, and you are still talking about climate change and they are still saying words about climate change. So that is what backlash effect is. It's when people dig their heels into their pre-existing belief and it seems like there's no rhyme or reason to it because their lizard brain is kicking into in response to what's happening with ours. And people are messy, it turns out. Humans are really messy, we're complicated, and we are capable of cognitive dissonance. So I live in Southern California. I live near Muscle Beach. I would like to have my shiny little biceps out there. And I like my couch and I think snacks are delicious, right? So cognitive dissonance. We can hold two different goals or aspirations or likes in our mind at the same time. Somebody mentioned deep canvas and wanting to learn more about that. A lot of the skills that we're going to talk about with the brave conversations um, are sort of like a stair step towards full deep canvassing. So a lot of the principles that we're discussing are also the underpinnings for why deep canvassing works and some of the practices that we're going to be using, even though we're going to be doing one-to-one outreach rather than deep canvassing, there are a lot of analogies. So this is sort of a stair step in that direction for people who are interested in deep canvas at some point down the pike. And one of the principles about why deep canvas works, and for those who are unfamiliar, these are longer form conversations in which the canvasser helps the person who they are canvassing talk out loud through their own cognitive dissonance. So it's more about curiosity. I saw that word in the chat earlier, and drawing out, and less about telling. And in that process, what happens is what social psychologists call self-persuasion. As the person talks out loud through their own cognitive dissonance, their brain notices that there are things that don't match. They're expending mental calories to go through that process. They're using what social psychologists call effortful consideration. And in that process, it's they're sort of leading themselves to the conclusion in a way that the canvasser is facilitating. And so that is a more effective methodology for persuasion than trying to tell a person what the change of mind should be, and helps us get around or obviate backlash effect to help the values align with the behavior and the opinion. So again, it's a myth that people make up their minds based on facts. 40 to 90% of decision making is based on emotion. And again, that doesn't mean that we're going to leave the facts off the table, but in order for the facts to be able to be digested and heard, we're going to need to start meeting reality on reality's terms, which is that people do tend to make up their minds based on emotion. And I have those little clinking beers to remind us what folks used to say about George W. Bush, which is that he was the kind of guy you'd like to have a beer with, right? And many of his voters were attributed to that analysis. So I'm being a little bit silly when I say that. And there's also a little bit of science underneath why that became a thing. So our goal in these relational conversations is going to be to remove emotional barriers to voting, right? We want to identify and remove what are emotional barriers to voting and gently and lovingly replace them with emotional incentives for voting. So would love to hear from folks in the room what you think some of the emotional barriers to voting might be. And once again, you can go ahead and put them into the chat, or you can raise a physical or electronic hand, and we'll get some of those into the conversation. My vote won't do anything. Absolutely. I don't like either candidate. Feel like it doesn't make a difference. Don't want to be disappointed. Hate it when my candidate loses. Yeah, I love that Madeline shares that one. Voting is actually an act of courage, right? We have to dare. It's risky. We have to dare to hope that we can make a difference. We have to dare to be invested in the outcome. So it's actually an emotional protection, not to seemingly not care about voting, to say, oh, that doesn't matter to me, it's all just a dumpster fire, etc. Marianne says some people believe there is no difference between the choices, people feeling like they don't know enough about the candidate or issues, don't know enough about climate change to debate it. Yeah, people not feeling like they know enough is an enormous barrier, which we will absolutely address with these conversations. Too busy, yep. Yeah, so no shortage of barriers. Some don't know there's an election, which is also definitely, that's a knowledge barrier for sure. So no shortage of barriers. Steve says believing in conspiracies. Yep. All right. So Per Epson-Stokeness is a social psychologist who works on climate change, and he's identified 5 Ds. He kind of did a little cheat move with the last one and used the D in identity. But he has identified these 5 Ds that can be barriers to climate messages being resonant with people. And so I'm just going to put these in the background of our awareness so that they're sort of there as we go through then how do we solve these barriers. The first one is distance. Now, this is true not just of climate change, but is true of all issues, right? If something feels far away from us, it can be overwhelming and just seem not relevant to us. And therefore, we are less likely to take action on it. So the example that he uses is, sort of the pictures that used to be used in the past of polar bears like floating on a little melting piece of ice. And that might be resonant with a lot of us who are activists, but the average American is motivated differently than we are. And that distance can be a barrier. And the same thing with voting. You know, those people don't understand me. They're going to do whatever they're going to do way off in Washington, D.C., etc. So we want to close that distance in our conversations. The second is doom. Again, we are weird. We are part of a small percentage of people who see an emergency and want to jump into the breach, right? For most people, from a psychological standpoint, doom, something that seems big, overwhelming, and scary, causes most people to want to bury their heads in the sand, because it's just too much. It's overwhelming and often yields cognitive dissonance, meaning that, you know, my values are in one place, my behavior is in another place. Denial is another function of feeling that the challenge that we might be dealing with is distance and doom laden. And we also may have built an identity that is not in alignment with the challenge needing to be solved, right? So an example of this is maybe my identity is tied up with my SUV or my truck that's a gas guzzler. Maybe my identity is tied up with not daring to hope and get involved. So these are all barriers that in our conversations, we're going to endeavor to close. And part of how we're going to close them is by bringing it out of the distant, out of the doom laden, and into the realm of real lived experience with emotional weight. So, what that means is that rather than talking in abstract terms or even in concrete terms that are about what is going to happen out there to our planet or our democracy, we're going to try to talk in terms that and draw out of the people that we're talking with their own real lived experience, things that have actually happened to them with emotional weight that matter to them. And that's going to bring the conversation out of those TV talking points. It's going to help move us out of flight or fight mode and them. And we're going to try to communicate by sharing stories about our lives and eliciting stories about their lives, which in turn helps us to avoid that backlash effect because we're no longer facting the person, we're story sharing with the person, and we're being vulnerable, which can help us to help them talk out loud through their own cognitive dissonance, right? Talking out loud through our own cognitive dissonance takes vulnerability. And so, if we, as the person initiating the conversation, can be vulnerable in sharing our stories, that acts as a social cue that it's okay for the other person to be vulnerable as well and allow us to connect to them at the level of shared values. Again, getting out of the TV talking points, getting out of the facts and things that are happening out there and connecting on those shared values so that we're no longer opponents in the conversation. We're not coming at each other in a debate. Now we're together in the conversation talking about shared values and what are we going to do with those shared values in relationship with one another and the world around us. And so once we have connected at that level, and now we're on the same team instead of two different teams, we can then work our way back up to the issue from there. And don't worry, that was a lot on that slide. I'm going to unpack that more when we get to the BRAVE overview. So, tools for uncovering real lived experience with emotional weight. And if you want to go practice on your friends, family, people in your community in the line, if you take nothing away from tonight other than this is a great thing to practice. which is if you get into a conversation about an issue like climate change or democracy and voting, this tool helps you bring it down to the level of real lived experience with emotional weight and start to unearth shared values. And this tool is simply these couple of sentences that are on the screen. So we're talking about climate change, and I heard on Fox News this, or this, or I heard on MSNBC this, and this, or it's all a dumpster fire. Well, it sounds like you really care about, oh, sorry, so sorry. I skipped over the first bullet. Let me just rewind. So then we want to ask, how does that impact you and your family, right? So we're moving out of the TV talking points, the abstraction, the big out there, into how that affects them and their family. And what you are doing at that moment when you ask that question is listening for a value that they care about. So, well, it's not fair. All these candidates seem the same, and we should have a candidate that's different from them. Okay, it sounds like you really care a lot about fairness. Can you remember a time when that crystallized for you? And so now we're getting down to the level of what are this person's values and how did they form so that we can connect in with that at the level of what our values are and how our values formed. I care a lot about fairness too. Here's how, I started to care about that. Here's an experience that happened to me when I was young or last week that has made me really care about fairness. Okay, so we already know that facts are not our friend, at least not at first. The other background piece before we jump into Brave that I want to share with you all is these lessons from political messaging. So there are 4 questions that any candidate should be able to answer in order to motivate people to be engaged. Do you understand me and my community? Will you fight for me and my community? Can you win? And do you need my help right now? So I'm planting that seed now, which we're going to come back to when we do the next training, because we may actually be able to be on a pathway in some of these conversations where it's not just, yes, I'll vote. It's, oh, and I'll also do postcards with you, or I'll also come to the phone bank, or I'll also do outreach like you're doing. And so we want to be able to answer these questions in a way that is not about a candidate, but is about us and our involvement. So the can you win is really a translating that is, is it going to make a difference? Is my vote going to make a difference? Is my engagement going to make a difference if I mobilize other people to vote? Okay. With all that in our backdrop, we're going to go through the 5 steps of Brave. So these are breathe, repeat, ask, validate, and engage. And so that's the acronym. And I'm going to unpack each one a little bit for you now. So we talked about how when the person that we're in communication with says that thing with which we vigorously disagree, the shoulders go up, the breathing gets heavy, the heart might beat fast. We go into that flight, fight, freeze, or fawn mode. So breathing in deeply, taking the shoulders down from being earrings, putting both feet on the floor squarely if we're sitting, making sure we're not, all crumpled up with our arms crossed, modeling openness physically, and taking those deep breaths in is going to do a few different things. One, it's going to cue our parasympathetic nervous system that we don't need to be in flight, fight, freeze, or fawn mode. Two, if we're concentrating on all of that, what we're not doing is talking and facting the person to death. And ideally, what we're doing in this moment also is summarizing whatever the person is saying in our head. This is a great tool to make sure that we actually are listening and we're not just spending the entire conversation thinking about what we're going to say next. And so by doing these things, what we are doing is starting to establish non-judgment, that the person can talk out loud through their own cognitive dissonance with us, that we're not going to attack them. So they can tell us what's on both sides of the issue for them. And that's going to allow us to help. That's going to allow us to help move them through that self-persuasion. And we're also establishing rapport, which again is very important for having the context in which we can help them talk out loud through their own cognitive dissonance. By physically modeling openness, that is also a cue to them that they don't need to be in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode, right? So people will respond to you physically in the way that you model for them. The next step is repeat and root out values. So this is the part that we just talked about with using the tool of tell me more. How does that affect you and your family and loved ones? Before we get to that, we're going to repeat back what they said to us. So that shows them that we are actively listening, that we are not judging them, and we're going to ask them in a neutral way, tell me more. How does that affect you and your family or loved ones? Using silence is also a great tool. So when we're in these conversations, again, we can have the urge to like tell people all the things really quickly and save them from their incorrectness. And in reality, they're going to be processing a lot. And so taking a beat and giving 5 seconds can feel like an eternity to us when we want the conversation to go well, but actually gives them time to process what is going on. And many times they will fill in that silence by sharing more with us that can help us root out shared values. And so we're going to continue to summarize what they are saying in our heads and repeat it back, which also can be a prompt for them to share more at the same time as deepening rapport and giving us more clues about what their values are. We're looking like a little detective. We're looking for those clues about what values might they hold. And then we're going to acknowledge frustrations. So there's a really important distinction here between agreeing and acknowledging. Acknowledging their frustrations does not mean we are saying that we agree with their point of view. It means that we are acknowledging that they feel frustration about whatever they are sharing with us. So, you know, in the example that I was using before, right? Oh, it's the candidates seem exactly the same. That's not fair. Maybe you think the candidates don't seem the same at all, but you can still acknowledge that to feel that way must be really difficult and frustrating. And again, you can weave in, it sounds like you really care about fairness. Can you remember a time that crystallized for you? The next step is that we're going to connect to values. And the purpose there is to both model vulnerability and make that connection that we talked about earlier when we were talking about real lived experience with emotional weight. So again, you'll want to share a story that relates to the value that you heard from them, sharing why for you, how in your life that became a value that matters to you. Maybe that was something that happened when you were a little kid, maybe more recently, and then connect that back to the issue. So, for me, I really came to care a lot about fairness because X, Y, and Z, or the first time I can remember caring about fairness was X, Y, and Z. And I care a lot about climate change because I think that it's unfair that our natural resources might not be available to the next generation or whatever the case may be. So we're connecting then back to the issue. And then finally, we want to get a commitment to a next step. So, of course, we are all passionate activists, and we would like that next step to be vote or volunteer. It may be that the next step is only to continue the conversation, or maybe they're to a point where they want to learn more, and you could send them an article at this stage because they're not in that backlash mode anymore. You've been able to connect on a value and they want to learn a little bit more. Maybe you can send them some voting information. So really flexible scale on the next step, but want to make sure that you do, if at all possible, walk away either with a commitment to continue the conversation or some other next step. Okay, so we're going to have some time for questions, but I'm just going to preview that after we walk away from this call, the next steps will be for you to complete your map and start thinking about on your calendar, when can you talk to these people that are on your personal network map. Hope that you'll all attend the next session where we'll actually practice Brave and workshop it together, right? This was the basic introduction to it. Next time, we'll go a little bit more slowly. We'll practice some of the component parts. You'll get a chance to work on it and debrief it. And then you can actually start practicing on people in your life, just using that first step of breathe and moving into a place of curiosity rather than a place of judgment. That's a really important skill for these conversations, is really getting curious and using that tool of how does that affect you and your family, and listening for values. So you can start practicing that if you are so inclined, which I hope some of you or all of you will be. So that said, we have, I think, about 10 minutes left for questions. Questions, reactions. Would love to hear any thoughts that folks have. If you want to raise a hand or type into the chat. Steve says, did you find people are really able to articulate how their values are crystallized? Yes, actually, it's pretty amazing what people are able to share. And I have had these conversations not just with people that I know, but with countless strangers in deep canvassing contexts. And there are two things that are helpful there. One, well, actually, three. Tell me more is like an absolutely magic phrase. Nobody is ever non-judgmentally asked like to share about themselves in our society, or very rarely are people, so it's twin skills. It's tell me more paired with non-judgment is super powerful. Number two is asking follow-up questions. So absolutely, you're right. We are not conditioned in our society to, in normal social situations, share how our values were formed. So it's sort of like peeling an onion. And that's why I say I'm mixing my metaphors wildly, which I do, but that's why I say it's a bit like being a detective, right? You're looking for a breadcrumb and you're getting one layer of the onion, and then you're asking a follow-up question. The other thing that helps people really open up is for you to share and model the type of response that you are hoping for. So that kind of can tend to prompt in others sharing at the same level. And we'll give you some tools next time to work on your own stories and articulating your own values. And the great thing about the onion of sharing shared values is that it's something we can work with over time and that can grow and change. When I first started telling my personal story more than 20 years ago in an organizing context, I was one of those people who hadn't figured out exactly how all of my values had coalesced. So I had a story that started much later for the first 3 years that I was organizing, and it was effective. And over time, it evolved and it kept, pieces of the onion peeled off for me. And I became more deeply aware of more of how my values had formed. So it's one of those things where it doesn't have to be perfect, or it doesn't have to be the ultimate thing that it might grow into in order to be effective. We can be effective from day one, and we can keep learning and growing. Awesome. Madeline.
First on that point, I'll just share, I had the experience in a deep canvassing training of, the script was like, ask them if they've ever had an experience. This was on immigration, with knowing somebody who'd immigrated or living in a different part of the country. And the person said no, but after I told my story, the person had his stories then come. So it was through the discussion that stuff came to mind. But what I wanted to say is that I realized we have an election Tuesday, April 2nd. It's our presidential preference survey. It's our city, mayor, county, school board elections, and there's 2 constitutional amendments on the ballot. We haven't made a campaign out of that. But when in the vein of practicing, there's an election in 5 days, and it occurs to me I could really just say to everybody around me, I realize suddenly I have to vote. Are you thinking about voting on Tuesday? And that's my opening line, because I feel like sometimes I just don't know how to start these conversations, but it's like, okay, well, that's pretty natural right now. That's my hope. Any thoughts on having a conversation?
I
that
think
soon?
Yeah. Are you asking me or the group?
Whoever, yeah, like how can we milk this immediate opportunity for practicing?
I see some nods around the room, and folks should feel free to raise a hand. I see a thumbs up, and I think that's a brilliant opening, and a great opportunity to start practicing. Other questions or reflections? Or reactions to Madeline's question?
I don't think voting really makes much of a difference.
You personally don't think it makes much of a difference?
No, I was joking and giving an opportunity for Madeline to practice her skills.
It's like, who let that guy in?
And Mike is my friend.
Yes, June.
Wait. Tell me more, Mike. Tell me more. How did you come to feel that way? There, I unclenched. Thank you, Mike.
Among youth, what are some common challenges that you have noticed?
Yeah, there's an interesting challenge and opportunity with youth. And of course, I will preface this by saying nothing is universal. Anything that we say about any group of people, there will be many, many, many exceptions. So there are many, many exceptions. This is not true of all youth. And I think there is a bit of a trend among younger Americans to be very passionate about issues like climate change, but but feel very disillusioned at the same time by the political process. So I think as a young person yourself, you are uniquely positioned to talk with folks who share your passion for climate change. And I suspect you could find a bunch of those among your peer groups. Uniquely positioned to talk with them and really key in on their passion about climate change and really understand from them what are the values that motivate them around climate change, and then share with them why that same value is motivating you around voting. I think there's a real opportunity there for young people. And I think there are a lot of the same challenges with young people as with all people with disillusionment. We saw a lot in the chat earlier, things that were different versions of it doesn't matter, I don't know enough, there's no difference between the candidates. And I think there's a permutation of that with young people, which is like the older generations left us with a mess to clean up and it's like too overwhelming, right? And so we can turn that frustration into motivation by tapping into the idea that actually, if young people turn out in large numbers, they can be the deciding voice in the election, and that vote is like currency after the election for your elected official to take your voice seriously, right? Like if we're voting, our elected officials are working for who is voting, right? I think those are a couple of sort of trends, challenges, and opportunities around young people.
Yeah, I definitely see a lot of disillusionment, myself included, when it comes to like the political process and government, and the feeling it feeds into that feeling of hopelessness. But I think I can help try to tap into that.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being a person who wants to do that. That's fantastic. And, I think being very real, I think we all feel that disillusionment at moments. And part of what's helpful about groups like this and coming together is it reminds us that we have people with whom we're in common cause. And if we band together, we actually can make a real and tangible difference. In Unify, we talk about a lot about the downward spiral of civic engagement, right? Where we hear a lot in our media about division and we hear about things being broken because there are actors who retain power through those mechanisms. And so I sort of see our job as folks who care about climate, who care about voting, is to reverse that downward spiral to an upward spiral. And the good news is that data tells us that's doable. Data tells us that these conversations work, and that it doesn't actually, in the big scheme of things, it does take a lot of them, but it doesn't take that many of them to make a big difference. So really want to thank all of you for being people who are helping to work on creating that upward spiral, and delighted to be here in conversation with you tonight. And I want to thank Madeline for inviting me and the group for having me, and look forward to being with you for the next Brave training.
Can you tell us about the next training?
Sure. I want to be mindful of time. So in 30 seconds time, I will say in the next training, we will do a deeper dive into some of the skills that will help us be successful in these conversations. So we'll unpack skills like non-judgment and curiosity and how we sort of unpeel the onion, and we'll get to practice them in breakouts so that you have a little bit more tools in your tool belt for each of those component parts of the process that you can kind of choose from as you need them when you're there in person in the conversations. And so that you also get a little practice in debrief. A lot of times we learn the most actually when we try the thing and then debrief and get to talk about it with each other. So we'll get to do that next time as well.
Thank you so much, Brandon.